What happens when a man sees too much? When every gesture, every word, every possibility shatters into 1,000 reflections. He does not act. He does not live. He descends. Underground. There, in the damp silence of a narrow room, sits a figure we cannot ignore. He is bitter. He is cruel. He is wounded. And yet, he is us. The underground man is not a character confined to Dostoevsky's novel. He is the echo of our own self-consciousness. The part of us that thinks too deeply, feels too sharply, and sabotages our own desire to be free. Tonight, we enter his world, not to escape it, but to recognize it. Because what lives underground lives also within us. Introduction. Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote Notes from Underground in 1864, in a time of great change. He had already faced a firing squad, only to be pardoned at the last moment. He had spent years in a Siberian prison camp, and he lived with epilepsy, poverty, and gambling debts. But none of these things defined him as much as his vision of the human soul. Where his contemporaries believed in rational progress, in reason and science as the great salvation of mankind, Dostoevsky wrote something different. A confession. The voice of a man too aware of himself to function in the world. A man who tears at his own flesh just to feel alive. That confession became Notes from Underground. It is not a story in the traditional sense. It is a wound, a testimony of shame, pride, cruelty, and longing. It is a mirror into the darkest corners of self-awareness. Dostoevsky shows us what happens when intelligence turns against itself. When the mind becomes so sharp, it cuts its own hand. The underground man is not a hero. He is not even a villain. He is a possibility, a warning, perhaps, of what happens when consciousness becomes unbearable. In this episode, we will step into his world. We will descend into the underground to confront the parts of ourselves we try hardest to deny. Chapter 1. The Birth of the Underground. The underground man is not simply a creation of Dostoevsky's imagination, but an embodiment of a certain human condition that arises when intelligence collides with despair, when self-awareness grows so sharp that it carves into the very flesh of the soul, leaving a person unable to live among others, and yet unable to silence the relentless murmur of his own consciousness. He is not a monster, not a saint, not even a fully developed character in the usual sense of a novel. He is more like an echo, a feverish monologue whispered from the corners of a room where the light barely reaches. A testimony of what it feels like to know oneself too deeply and to despise that knowledge. He emerges at a time when the world around him is filled with optimism, when philosophers and politicians in Russia and across Europe believe in the promise of reason, in the possibility of building a rational society where every individual pursues self-interest logically, and in doing so creates harmony for all. But Dostoevsky, who had faced execution, who had tasted prison, who had seen the fragility of the human spirit, knew something different. He knew that human beings are not rational machines, that we resist the formulas of progress, that inside us lives a contradiction far more powerful than logic. And so he wrote a man who embodies that resistance, a man who refuses to be explained by equations, who hides underground precisely because he cannot and will not fit into the clean geometry of a rational age. The underground is not just a physical space, though it is imagined as a damp room with cracked walls and dripping water. It is also a psychological metaphor, a descent into the hidden basement of the human condition, where shame, envy, and unspoken desires dwell. To be underground is to be aware of everything and to act on nothing, to observe one's own impulses like a scientist peering into a cage, but never to break free from the glass. The underground man tells us that he has withdrawn because he is sick, because he is spiteful, because he cannot bear the falseness of the world above. But in truth, his sickness is his awareness. His spite is his lucidity. And his withdrawal is the natural consequence of a soul that cannot reconcile itself with life as it is. From the very first pages, we hear his confession that he is a sick man, a wicked man, a man filled with bitterness and bile. Yet he speaks not to ask for pity, but to expose the irony that even in his degradation, he clings to a strange sense of pride. He knows that his confession is ugly, that it will repel us, yet he also knows that it is precisely this ugliness that makes him authentic. For in a society built on false smiles and illusions of progress, what could be more honest than declaring one's own ruin? He becomes a prophet of negativity, a witness to the fact that man does not live by bread or by reason or by systems, but by the mysterious, destructive, passionate currents that run beneath the surface. The birth of the underground, then, is the birth of a voice that refuses harmony, refuses simple answers, refuses the comfort of belonging. It is the sound of a man scratching against the walls of his own cell, knowing that escape is impossible, but also knowing that to remain silent would be worse. Dostoevsky offers us this voice not to romanticize suffering, but to show us a truth that polite society cannot bear to admit, that beneath the polished floors of civilization, beneath our rational justifications and our fragile smiles, there lies an underground where each of us wrestles with shame, with resentment, with the aching knowledge that we cannot ever be as rational, as pure, or as happy as we pretend. And so, the underground man begins his confession, and in doing so, Dostoevsky invites us into that hidden chamber of the soul, not as spectators of a strange pathology, but as participants in a drama we know all too well, because the underground is not merely his dwelling, it is ours. Chapter 2. The Curse of Consciousness. Consciousness, for Dostoevsky, is not a gift, but a burden, not a lantern that lights the path forward, but a fire that consumes the one who carries it. For the underground man does not envy the thinkers, the philosophers, the dreamers of progress. He envies instead the men of action, those who live without hesitation, who strike, who fight, who drink, who gamble, who march into battle or into love without the torment of reflection. And it is this very contrast that defines his suffering. Because to him, life is always deferred, always obstructed by the endless machinery of thought. To act, he says, is to be blind, to see only what lies directly ahead, and yet to act is also to live. For a man who is constantly aware of every possible consequence, every hidden motivation, every contradiction inside himself, can never act at all. And so his consciousness becomes a cage built of mirrors, reflecting his own cowardice back at him until he is paralyzed. The underground man knows he is intelligent. He knows he sees deeper than the men around him. But he also knows that this intelligence condemns him to inertia. For the simple soldier who charges into war, the gambler who risks everything at the table, the lover who throws himself into passion without forethought, these are the men who taste life, even if their choices are foolish, even if they end in ruin, because at least they moved, at least they acted, at least they were alive. He, on the other hand, sits in his room, analyzing his every impulse until it collapses beneath the weight of its own contradictions, and he despises himself for this, despises the way his thoughts multiply like vermin in the dark, despises the way he mocks his own desires before they have a chance to breathe, despises the way he knows that he will never change. He tells us that excessive consciousness is a sickness, and he is right. For awareness taken to its extreme becomes a form of self-destruction, a scalpel turned against the very body it was meant to heal. Dostoevsky shows us here the paradox of human intelligence, that to know too much is to be immobilized, that the deeper one peers into the abyss of possibility, the less one is capable of simple action. We like to think that reflection is a virtue, that awareness is strength, but the underground man reveals the shadow side of thought, the place where analysis becomes paralysis, where the mind sabotages the will, where a man's greatest strength turns against him like a traitor in the night. And yet, even in this torment, he clings to his awareness with a twisted pride, for he would rather suffer consciously than live blindly, rather rot in his underground with the full knowledge of his degradation than run in the sunlight like a fool who believes in progress and harmony. This is his curse and his paradox. He despises his consciousness, but he cannot and will not abandon it, because without it, he would not feel superior. And without feeling superior, he would not exist at all. So the underground man becomes a prophet of negation, a martyr to overthinking, a living symbol of the truth that there is no guarantee that more knowledge leads to more happiness, that sometimes the brightest minds are the darkest souls, that sometimes the one who sees most clearly is the one who can least endure what he sees. In this way, Dostoevsky dismantles the optimism of his age, showing us that consciousness, far from saving us, may condemn us to endless hesitation, that intelligence without faith, without action, without love, becomes a poison. And we, listening to his confession, cannot help but recognize a part of ourselves in this torment. For who among us has not felt paralyzed by our own thoughts? Who has not felt the weight of too much awareness pressing down until even the smallest decision feels unbearable? The underground man names this paralysis his sickness, but in truth, it is a sickness that runs through all of us, a curse hidden inside the very thing we call our intelligence, the unbearable sharpness of consciousness that cuts too deep and leaves us bleeding in silence. Chapter 3: Cruelty, Shame, and the Desire to be Seen. The underground man tells us he is cruel, spiteful, and filled with malice. But beneath that cruelty lies something far more fragile: the unbearable hunger to be acknowledged, to be seen, to matter in the eyes of others. And so much of his suffering comes from this contradiction, that he despises society and yet longs desperately for its approval, that he isolates himself and yet dreams of recognition, that he mocks others and yet cannot endure their laughter. His cruelty is not the cruelty of strength, but the cruelty of weakness, of a man who cannot act with dignity and so lashes out in humiliation, hoping that by hurting others, he might at least prove that he exists. We see this most vividly in the dinner scene, when the underground man, who has withdrawn from his old classmates for years, insists on joining them, driven not by friendship or joy, but by a bitter need to assert himself, to show them that he too belongs, that he is not invisible. And yet, from the moment he arrives, he is consumed with shame, awkwardness, and rage, sitting at the table as an intruder, mocking their laughter in his mind, but secretly longing to be included, desperate to escape and yet unable to leave. He builds up entire dialogues in his head, anticipating insults, imagining how he will respond, how he will outwit them. But in reality, he remains silent, sweating, humiliated, caught between the fantasies of triumph and the reality of impotence. Here we see Dostoevsky's genius, for he shows us the psychology of shame not as an occasional emotion, but as a consuming fire, a force that shapes an entire existence. The underground man lives in shame, breathes shame, turns even the smallest encounter into a theater of humiliation. He wants to dominate others, to rise above them, to prove his superiority. But the more he tries, the deeper he falls, because he is trapped in the very cycle of recognition he despises. He rejects the world, but cannot live without it. He sneers at the opinion of others, but cannot stop measuring himself against them. He hides underground, but listens for footsteps above. Cruelty, then, becomes his defense, a mask he wears to hide the trembling vulnerability beneath. He mocks others before they can mock him. He lashes out before he can be struck. He diminishes every gesture of kindness as hypocrisy, every word of affection as weakness, every attempt at connection as a trap. And yet we feel, as readers, that what he truly longs for is not domination, but intimacy, not triumph, but tenderness, that his cruelty is a distorted plea for love. Dostoevsky understood this paradox deeply, for he knew that human beings are not consistent, that we wound those we most want to embrace, that we sabotage our own happiness because we fear the pain of losing it, that shame often disguises itself as aggression. In The Underground Man, he distilled all of this into a single figure who, in his drunken monologues and spiteful gestures, reveals the fragility of every human heart. We recognize ourselves in him because we too have wanted to be admired by those we secretly despised. We too have felt the sting of exclusion and the desperate hunger for recognition. We too have hidden our vulnerability behind sarcasm or anger. We too have wished to be seen and yet feared what being seen might expose. His dinner humiliation is not just his, it is ours. A mirror held up to the part of us that trembles when laughter is not ours, when a seat at the table feels precarious, when the need to be acknowledged becomes unbearable. And so cruelty and shame, far from being opposites, become two faces of the same wound. The wound of a soul that longs for connection but finds only isolation, that craves love but transforms it into bitterness, that wants to rise but drags itself deeper underground. Dostoevsky shows us this not to condemn but to reveal, for he knew that in every heart there is this trembling desire to be seen, and that in our failure to admit it, we become cruel. Chapter 4. The Encounter with Liza. If the underground man is defined by shame, spite, and paralysis, then the encounter with Liza reveals the faint glimmer of what might have been redemption. For in her presence we see not only his cruelty, but also his unbearable hunger for tenderness, a hunger he cannot admit even to himself. And so their meeting becomes one of the most haunting confessions in all of Dostoevsky's work. Liza is a prostitute, a young woman forced into degradation not by choice but by the brutal necessities of survival. And when she enters underground man's life, she carries with her the possibility of intimacy, the possibility of love, the possibility of being known without mockery. And yet, rather than embrace her with compassion, he exposes his deepest contradictions, for he mocks her, wounds her, delivers to her a cruel sermon about the fate that awaits her, about the ruin she cannot escape, about the emptiness of her hope. He paints her life as a tragic inevitability, stripping her of dignity under the guise of honesty, as though tearing down her illusions were somehow a gift. But what he is truly doing is projecting his own despair, forcing her to carry the weight of his underground, dragging her into the abyss in which he has chosen to dwell. And yet, and this is what makes Dostoevsky so terrifyingly honest, beneath this cruelty we can sense something trembling, something fragile, something that desires her presence, something that longs for her hand upon his own. For when he speaks to her of ruin, he is not only condemning her fate, but confessing his own, revealing the very wound that he cannot otherwise admit. His cruelty is his shame, but his shame is also his longing, and in this paradox we glimpse the truth of his humanity. When Liza returns to him later, when she comes to his underground chamber, there is a moment, a brief, flickering moment, when redemption seems possible, when love, even in its most fragile form, seems to offer a way out of the darkness. She comes to him not out of pity, but out of recognition, having heard in his words not only cruelty, but also the truth of his suffering, and she reaches for him with a compassion he has never known. But instead of accepting it, instead of surrendering to her tenderness, he recoils, insults her, humiliates her, drives her away. He cannot allow himself to be loved, because to be loved would mean to admit that he deserves it, and he cannot bear that possibility. Dostoevsky understood this cruel paradox, that sometimes the ones who need love most are the least capable of receiving it, that shame becomes so deeply woven into the soul that every gesture of kindness feels like an unbearable exposure, that we sabotage the very intimacy we crave because it terrifies us more than solitude. The underground man destroys the only chance he has to escape his isolation, and he does so with full awareness, hating himself as he does it, hating the way his own hands push her away even as his heart longs to hold her. In Liza, we see the possibility of light. In his rejection of her, we see the inevitability of his descent. She is a mirror held before him, a mirror that shows both the cruelty he cannot escape and the tenderness he cannot allow. And when she leaves, when she walks away into the night, the underground is sealed once more, his fate confirmed, his shame complete. But what lingers for us as readers is not only his cruelty, but the haunting recognition that we too have turned away from the very thing we most desired, that we too have destroyed connections out of fear, that we too have chosen the familiar prison of solitude over the terrifying vulnerability of being loved. And in that recognition, Dostoevsky speaks not only of one man in a damp room, but of all of us, of the human soul trembling between the possibility of redemption and the certainty of ruin. Chapter 5. Why we choose pain. At the end of his confession, the underground man offers us a truth so unsettling that it overturns the very foundations of rational optimism, for he insists that man is not a creature of reason, not a machine that seeks only comfort and advantage, not a being who will be satisfied when all needs are met and all desires calculated, but something wilder, more unpredictable, more self-destructive, and therefore more human. He says that if ever we built the perfect society, if ever we constructed the crystal palace of rational harmony, where every hunger is answered and every conflict dissolved, man would smash it to pieces simply to prove that he is free, that he cannot be reduced to an equation, that he is capable of choosing against his own best interest. This, for Dostoevsky, is the final rebellion of the human soul, the refusal to be explained, the refusal to be tamed, the refusal to live as though we were only animals seeking warmth and bread. We crave bread, yes, and we crave security. But we crave just as much the thrill of risk, the sting of humiliation, the ecstasy of chaos, the taste of destruction. We want to assert ourselves even if it means our own ruin, because to live without freedom is worse than to live in pain. And so man chooses suffering, not because he loves it, but because in suffering he feels his will. In pain, he asserts that he is not merely a cog in the machine. In rebellion, he proves that he cannot be predicted or programmed. The underground man tells us that reason may promise happiness, but happiness is not enough. That we would rather throw ourselves against the walls of the Crystal Palace than accept a life where everything is solved. That the human soul is made not only for comfort, but for conflict, contradiction, and mystery. This is why he clings to his underground, why he sabotages love, why he mocks progress, why he chooses humiliation over harmony. Because in the very act of suffering, he feels his own freedom, because pain becomes proof that he is still alive. Dostoevsky leaves us here with a truth that is as dark as it is liberating. That to be human is not to seek perfection, but to embrace the storm. Not to dissolve into rational systems, but to assert again and again that even at our most broken, we are still free. And so we leave the underground man where we found him, in his narrow room, surrounded by cracked walls and dripping silence, muttering his confession into the void. A figure both pitiful and terrifying, because in his voice we hear not only the ruin of one man, but the trembling of our own hidden selves. Dostoevsky does not give us resolution, does not offer redemption, does not allow us the comfort of escape. Because the underground is not a place we visit once and leave behind. It is a truth about consciousness itself. The place where shame and longing, cruelty and tenderness, freedom and despair all collide in unbearable intensity. We would like to believe that we are different, that we would act with more dignity, that we would accept love when it is offered, that we would choose harmony instead of pain. But Dostoevsky forces us to admit that the underground runs beneath us all, that each of us has moments when we sabotage what we most desire, when we prefer suffering to simplicity, when we cling to our wounds because they remind us that we are still alive. The underground man is not broken, and neither are we. He is simply the part of us that refuses to be tamed, that chooses pain over perfection, that whispers in the dark, "I am still free."